There's a general rule that most everyone is familiar with: honor and respect your elders. In the world of tokusatsu, this can't be emphasized enough. Especially in recent iterations, modern seasons of Sentai, Rider, and Ultraman seem to integrate their past heroes to varying degrees of importance. For some, it may be a core aspect of their powers and transformations, while for others, it's more so a fun nod that gets the audiences excited. Regardless, it can be pretty much guaranteed that past heroes in each franchise's legacy will have some sort of presence in seasons moving forward. Especially with how gimmick-heavy modern seasons are, it's pretty easy to find at least some way to reel in some recognition for the prior series that have helped build up this time-honored legacy. But how does a franchise approach this past hero integration into their respective series? For today, I want to examine specifically the way that Kamen Rider executes this practice. We've seen that within the past phases, there's been different ways that writers tap into the powers of their predecessors. Maybe it's integral to their story, and maybe it's just to sell more toys. But either way, for today's deep dive, we're going to look at the different styles and executions of Kamen Rider's Legend Rider forms. Let's henshin and get to it. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to expand the term Legend Rider to include forms that may or may not be classified as such, but still achieve the purpose of being based on a previous rider. I'm going to focus less on Kamen Rider Decade. Even though he is the most obvious example of a rider's powers being based on his predecessors, he literally just turns into that rider, with the belt being replaced by his Deca driver. I'm more interested in the forms that actually have to be creative and try to stick with the thematic operations of the existing gimmick in order to honor the previous riders. So let's look at how this is usually done. At this point, there are a few ways these legend forms are done. More often, we'll see them as fun nods that make appearances in movies or games and may not be as consequential to the overarching story. In Kamen Rider Ex-Aid, Legend Riders found their way into the gamer sphere as movie specials in the form of the Legend Rider Gashats. These were of course easily repurposed from the base Gashat design, with the most significant change being the label. Then, each Gashat was given a title that integrated each Legend Rider's name along with a prefixed phrase that was themed appropriately to their concept. For example, the demon drummer Hibiki got his Gashat named Taiko Master Hibiki, while Fies got his game named as Moshi Moshi Fies in reference to the Fies Gear phone. These game titles are a quick, fun, and easy way to pay homage to these riders. And then, of course, the forms themselves were stylized very similarly to how the baseline level 2 riders were, and this was pretty interesting. Since the main Ex-Aid riders had their level 1 faces on their backs like backpacks, that's exactly how it was done for these Legend Riders too. Then, the helmets would see a slight redesign to correspond with the Legend Riders' helmets. The peculiar thing about this was that even though they added the previous riders' facial embellishments, they kept Ex-Aid's visor outline on the mask and didn't keep the designs enclosed in that space. So on the face, it looks like a very surface level tribute to the Legend Rider with a visor shape slapped on there with no regard for the actual eyes. I always thought this was kind of a weak point of Ex-Aid's Legend Rider design. The faces on the back were pretty genius, but the execution of the helmets just seemed a bit sloppy and not as well thought out. Of course, only a few of these forms would see actual screen time, whereas most of the others would be found only in the Gamba Rising games, so it sort of makes sense as to why there isn't that much effort put into them. The legend icons of Kamen Rider Ghost did something similar, but just a tad bit differently. First off, going over the legend icons, these things were treated very similarly as the legend Gashats, with just the decals themselves seeing most of the change. While the normal icons would have their respective faces, the legend icons would have the full depictions of the rider faces within. Nothing too crazy or monumental about that. What was pretty awesome though was the form execution itself. One thing about Ghost that makes it so iconic, no pun intended, is that his rider form wears a jacket which is changed out from form to form. So, naturally, this lends extremely well to having a colorful collection of rider jackets. Especially when you can pretty explicitly place the designs on these jackets, it adds for a form that sports some flashy and stylish tributes. Given how Ghost's helmet design is, it's essentially a blank canvas for the Legend Rider's face to be painted on. What's pretty funny about this is that if the form includes any detailing that exceeds the normal facial frame, it's added onto the hood. For example, while Gaim's main helmet crest is combined with Ghost's horn, the golden side pieces become part of the hood. And for Drive, well, his spoilers are placed aptly atop the hood as well. Similarly to the Ex-Aid Legend forms, they also see limited screen time and predominantly exist in Gamba Rising. The legend forms I found to be really cool and creative, however, are the ones from Kamen Rider Gaim. These of course take the form of the Legend Rider Lock Seeds. As each Lock Seed's cover is molded with a shape that is indicative of the type of fruit they represent, this would need to be done for these new legendary Lock Seeds as well. However, the way they did this was interesting. Instead of having a neutral, front-facing view of the rider helmet, they have it as a 3/4 side profile, which was an interesting choice. To be honest, it always kind of irked me that most, if not all, the other Lockseeds are symmetrical in their faces, but for the rider designs they decided to stray from that specific convention. Nevertheless, these newly molded and designed Lockseeds similarly had a picture of the rider's drivers and gimmicks inside of the lock itself. What was really cool was the integration of the Legend Rider forms along with the fruit armor concept. In Gaim, the fruits of each Lockseed descend upon each rider and open up to adorn each rider with the appropriately styled armor. For the Legend Riders, these fruits take the form of the rider helmets themselves, and, like the other Lockseeds do, they open up and descend upon the rider, revealing these legendary stylized shoulder, chest, and helmet pieces. I think this is such a creative way to integrate the Legend Rider forms. The Lockseed and fruit gimmick already lend themselves to a transformation mechanic, so to be able to transition from the goofy pumpkin-shaped helmets to the more shapely and thematically appropriate armors is even more natural. The Legend Lockseeds really make for some amazing rider tributes, effectively fusing each rider's signature design conventions into the already dynamic and iconic armor rider concepts. Now, I know I mentioned that I'd focus less on Decade's form transformations because he just turns into the rider and it's as simple as that. This is also something that happens with Kamen Rider Build. Build didn't have a huge emphasis on the Legend Rider forms, and when they did, it was just in the movie where he turned into Ex-Aid. But Build also did something kind of interesting with this. They sort of had two executions of rider tributes. The first one was the actually officially designated Legend Rider full bottle series. These bottles were incredibly simple, they were all the same design and had each rider's name labeled on it with a small image of the rider on it as well. These were not necessarily used to transform into each rider, as they represented a containment of each rider's essence. In the Build Ex-Aid movie, Build is shown extracting Ex-Aid's powers, resulting in the creation of this Legend Rider full bottle. These ones are a bit generic, and we really don't see any other ones show up aside from the DX set. The real deal is with the individual full bottles themselves. Something I thought that Build did well was integrate the Legend Rider concept into its series gimmick without it being too on the nose. As a tribute to each rider, specific full bottle best matches were made to represent each rider, and like I said, it wasn't a very surface level on the nose reference. The best matches actually represented two key elements from each rider series. For example, Build used the Doctor and Gaim full bottles to transform into Ex-Aid, specifically referencing the gaming and Doctor motifs within the show. They did release more full bottles with the intent of representing past riders. With these new full bottles, they would actually have a best match with some already existing bottles. For example, for Wizard, they made the Mahotsukai or Wizard full bottle, which was a best match with Diamond, previously matched with Gorilla, which is an obvious reference to Wizard's magic and gemstone motifs. In that same set, Gaim would have an orange full bottle, matched with Dragon's best match, Lock, which of course referenced Gaim's citrus sword as well as the series' Lockseed gimmick. O's and Double would have their own matches as well, but my favorite of these has to be the best match for Fours, the Yujo or Friendship and Rocket full bottles. This of course is a reference to Fours' galactic motif, as well as Gentaro's strong desire and passion for the bonds of friendship. Each rider, and even Sentai season, is made up of a combination of motifs in order to stay exciting and innovative. With the best match gimmick of Build, this opened up a great way to pay homage to the past riders at not just face value, but by breaking down some of the most important concepts and themes of their shows. It was a really creative take on the Legend Rider concept. Even though it wasn't necessarily utilized much in the show, their designs and existence truly honor the ingenuity behind Rider as a franchise. So these are the Legend Rider forms that are mostly used as fun, surface level tributes to past riders. But there's been some instances where the Legend Rider forms are actually integral to the rider's story, as well as their vast set of powers and armaments. Let's talk first about the King of Time himself, Kamen Rider Go. Go marked the 20th anniversary of the Heisei era of riders, so naturally, past riders would play an incredibly large factor into the concept and powers of the titular rider. Very similarly to Tsukasa and Decade, Sogo would meet various different riders throughout the different time periods in order to gain their trust and support in taking down the various and other riders that threaten the balance of space and time. In Decade, when Tsukasa fully gained the powers of the riders whose worlds he visited, he gained access to their forms, final form rides, and final attack rides. In Go, these powers came in the form of the Ride Watches. The Ride Watches are basically Go and Gaze's only power-ups, and they only take their powers from the Legend Riders. So, when either of them puts on the secondary Ride Watch onto their GQ driver, it initiates the Armor Time gimmick that bestows upon the rider a themed set of armor that allows access to similarly stylized weapons and armaments of their respective Legend Rider. For example, Go's first Ride Watch, Build, grants him the power in the form of two huge full bottle shoulder pieces, as well as a drill arm modeled exactly that after Build's Drill Crusher. For Ex-Aid, his shoulders got the Gotchard treatment, with both of his arms becoming hammer ends, referencing Ex-Aid's Gashikon breaker. The armors were, of course, designed with direct correlation to each respective Legend Rider. Unlike the previous few executions we talked about, the goal of these forms wasn't necessarily to integrate the past Rider forms into the current Rider gimmick in a clever or subtle way. These armored forms were pretty big and bombastic, utilizing every single detail of the Legend Rider to arm Geo and Gates with another Rider busting power. In addition to these ride watches providing armor based on the Legend Rider's base forms, Decade's ride watch act as an attachment with its own slot, in which a ride watch could be inserted and Geo's powers would be upgraded with the Legend Rider's super form. This one was pretty easy. They literally slapped on the chest and shoulder armors of Geo's Decade armor on top of the respective rider's super form suit. It was a pretty creative way to access more of each rider's powers, and it also made sense that this was made possible through the powers of a rider with a similar concept. Honestly, Geo's Legend Rider integration was really cool, innovative, but kinda really busy. All of these forms really had a lot going on, to the point where some of them looked kinda clunky and like they were busy for the sake of being busy. And I know that I've used on the nose quite a bit already, but I felt like the gimmick shoulders of each form were very on the nose. Would shoulder armor that looked more like their respective riders have been more apt and streamlined? Or maybe just something completely new that pays homage to their design conventions somehow? I think it was with Double's armor form that made me go, okay, this is a bit much. Granted, for something like Heisei's 20th Rider anniversary, I'm sure the objective of the design team was to go hard or go home and be as explicit as possible when referencing the different pieces of Heisei Rider history. But still, it feels like a bit much, and it's honestly why I never got on board with Geo's designs and style. While this gimmick and concept had its own range of freedom in terms of interpreting each Rider power, in my opinion the absence of restriction led to some less elegant but some insanely creative Legend Rider forms. While Geo would present us with some wild takes on the powers of Legend Riders, another rider would appear not too far along later that would take the Legend Rider concept into their own hands and bring out something that was really out there. Kamen Rider Revice took its place as the third Reiwa Rider series, but also marked 50 years of the franchise overall. While it wasn't explicitly an anniversary series like Decade or Geo, it made sure to somehow integrate past riders into the show's core gimmicks and mechanics. Revice's story and concept revolves around the Vice stamps, which contain genetic information from the certain animals that allow Revi and Vice to access powerful abilities based on said animals. Various Vice stamps are used by both the heroes and antagonists of the story, but there's one thing about Revi and Vice's Vice stamps that is consistent. They're all influenced by past Kamen Riders. Yes, the main power of each stamp is derived from that particular animal, but if you look ever so closely, the image of the Kamen Rider's helmet is right behind the animal symbol. Now you may be thinking, this means that each animal is probably related to each rider, right? That's the only way this could make logical sense. Well, let me go ahead and counter that thought with a mammoth that looks like Deno. The Vice stamps and their connections to past riders have much less of a basis than past legend forms would have. For example, Decade's tribute takes the form of the Megalodon genome, with the deep sea design integrating the Barcode Warrior's iconic lines. Fize's power takes the form of the Terra genome, where the antenna-ish part of Fize's helmet takes the form of the pterodactyl fin, and his armor plates appearing more stylized as wings. And perhaps the most humorous one, Geo's image appears in the Brachio genome, where the watch strap design appears on Revi with a lot more links, which lends itself to the combined Brachiosaurus form. It goes without saying that all of these seem incredibly random, right? For this gimmick, the focus seems to be more so on the animal enhancements. However, when Revi and Vice activate these genome changes, their forms are actually thoughtful integrations of the animal image with regards to the Legend Rider style. You know those silver bits outside of Deno's peach eyes? I never would have expected them to turn into mammoth tusks. And Forza's bulky forearms being attributed to gorilla arms? That's pretty darn smart. There's a lot of really clever innovation that happened with Revice's power-ups. The riders are being anamorphed into beasts that you would never have expected them to be. In a way, it's really random and doesn't showcase a consistent sense of correlation among this line's concept and design convention. In another way, it's a huge testament to the creativity that they were even able to pull these off. I'll admit that initially, the forms of Revice were a huge turnoff for me due to this very reason. I wasn't able to draw a solid correlation or reasoning for these forms, and it felt like things were being haphazardly put together for the sake of being cool and out there. However, after watching through more Revice and seeing how the Legend Riders themselves weren't really a main focus of the gimmick, I started to appreciate the outlandish logic that went into putting these wacky forms together. It sort of reminds you that it is and isn't an anniversary show at the same time, and that's okay. I think Geo's Rider armor was an example of power-ups that use every piece of the rider in its form, whereas Revice does the exact same thing while transforming it into something original. It's really quite awesome to see just how much these past riders can be utilized and integrated into the core components of these riders' powers and abilities. I would probably be remiss if I didn't at least bring up the legend forms of Kamen Rider Gotchard. The Rider legacy is being carried in two different ways, one of which is through Kamen Rider Legend, who has the ability to transform into and summon past riders through their respective Kemi cards. While he's only appeared in the Legend Gotchard special so far, he is set to be included into the main show, so we'll see where he goes from here. Gotchard himself does have access to his own legend forms through the Rider's Kemi cards. In true alchemical fashion, Gotchard's forms combine the two riders into these special golden forms. They sport some impressive new helmet work, but the body, as far as I know, is mostly kit bashed. Just like Legend, these have really only appeared in the special so far, but as the show continues, who knows if they'll play a bigger part in the main story. Alright, and I know I said I wouldn't talk much about Decade since he technically doesn't have special Legend Rider forms, but he does have an undeniably very creative alternative with the final form rides. These cards would grant the riders he was fighting with an appropriately themed transformation into an armament or support mechanism for the battle. This was really cool because the transformations would be in direct reference to a concept within each rider's respective show. For example, Hibiki would turn into an enlarged version of his own Gekiko for Decade to slam some beats in, and Ryuki would transform into his own contract beast, Drag Rider, to give Decade some draconic firepower. Being Rider's first explicit tribute season, seeing these final form rides done was a loving tribute to each Rider season and concept, and seeing Decade essentially take their role in the fight to deliver the final blow was just the icing on top of this magenta colored cake. There's something quite satisfying about the way that Kamen Rider honors its legacy. There isn't an aggressive push to create an overarching narrative like many other franchises may have, but there's still some sort of presence of past heroes in newer seasons. To include Legend Rider forms into a writer's armory breathes new life into their concept, where they can adapt themselves to match the new current style or reinvent themselves entirely. Not only do they serve to bestow wonderful powers upon the current heroes of the season, but they do so in a way that honors its roots and celebrates the passing of power from generation to generation. So those are my thoughts on the Legend Rider concept so far. Which style do you prefer to see Legend Rider forms in? Let me know. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back with some more fun Toku topics to Toku talk about. See y'all next time.